And we're back, everyone. This is going to be our video to finish the muscle tissue chapter, and then we're going to start the muscular system, the muscles themselves. So we're finishing the muscle tissue, and then we're going to start the muscular system. All right, I think I'm going to use green today. So if you remember, we've been filling in some of the miscellaneous. So now that we've talked about the steps of muscle contraction, now that we've talked about the motor unit and how the nerve and the nerve endings interact with the muscle, we've just been saying some miscellaneous things like your muscle tends to recruit small motor units first. That as we repeatedly contract a muscle, we have more calcium available, so repeated contractions can be stronger. We talked about the range of motion at which we can generate the most force, mid-range. Now we have some other things, miscellaneous, to fill in. If we think about the muscle and what it needs to contract, it needs certain tools, it needs certain ingredients to contract. So we've already talked about the nerve impulse. One thing that a muscle needs is a nerve impulse. What else does it need? It needs calcium. We talked about that, correct? So there's something else that we haven't yet talked about, and that is fuel. The energy, the fuel. What is going to be the fuel? And of course, you know this, it is our usable energy form, ATP. How do we generate ATP? We convert carbs and or fat into this usable energy form, ATP. So we just have to address this ingredient. If you're interested, if we go back to the steps of muscle contraction, the ATP comes into play because the ATP is what pulls a myosin head off of actin. And then that ATP is broken down into stored energy in the myosin head for the next round. So when we talked about the myosin head using stored energy to actually fuel the power stroke, to cause the actin and myosin to slide together, that fuel source is ATP. Or ATP broken down into ADP and a phosphate. But it's still coming from ATP. So we need to make sure we review what are the energy pathways that are converting carbs and fat, and sometimes protein, but mostly carbs and fat, into ATP. All you need to know is the order. The muscles will first generate ATP through the creatine phosphate system. You might hear it called phosphocreatine. But this is what can generate ATP initially, I would say for about 10 seconds, and it is anaerobic, which means without oxygen. For an exercise, or when we're asking the muscle to contract for longer than 10 seconds, then we're going to start to tap into producing ATP, aerobic glycolysis. Just going to forget that phone call there. I'm not sure if that showed up. Anaerobic glycolysis will produce energy for another 45 seconds, 40 seconds or so. Again, these are ballpark figures, and this is also anaerobic. However, if we're exercising or contracting our muscle for a minute, minute and a half or more, we are utilizing aerobic respiration. And of course, this is the aerobic form. Just know the order and about how long each can produce energy for, and which are anaerobic and which are aerobic. This is able to move in both directions. Of course, when we start to exercise, we generate first from the creatine phosphate, then anaerobic glycolysis, then aerobic. But if you have a sudden burst 10 minutes into your exercise session, well, we might start to go backwards because a sudden burst, we need quick energy, and carbs anaerobically can provide it quickly. But then once you settle back into your groove, you might go back. So it's a continuum. Other things to consider. There are different types of muscle fibers. We tend to have two basic types of muscle fibers, type 1, type 2. Type 1, type 2. Type 1 are our longer lasting. Think about a marathon runner. They're going to utilize more of type 1. Type 2 are our fast twitch. These are short lasting, but are strong contractions. Most of these do not require oxygen. So we tend to be utilizing a combination of both. Every muscle has a combination of both. We can look at an actual, this is a cross-section of the muscle. These are the muscle fibers. That's what we're looking at. These are the muscle fibers. When we stain them a certain way, we can see that some are type 1, some are type 2. The slow twitch is type 1. The fast twitch is type 2. There's different types of fast twitch oxidative, fast twitch glycolytic, but we have a combination of both. We tend to be using a combination of both. However, a marathon runner is going to be using more of type 1, slow twitch, longer lasting, but not as strong in intensity. Type 2 is going to be utilized more by a weightlifter or a sprinter. High intense, but you cannot hold on to a high intense contraction at that intensity for long. We tend to always be using a combination of both. That picture there is Eliud Kipchoge, who did do a full marathon, 26.2 miles in under 2 hours. It was not eligible for a world record, though, because it was on a closed course where he had pacers. They surrounded him to reduce some of the draft. They actually had a line. You can see the car shining the light there to make sure that he did not veer from the shortest possible distance. Quite a feat. That is an average pace per mile of 4 minutes and 34 seconds, which is insane. I give you some extra information. A lot of this you're not going to have to know. I'm not going to ask you about fatigue on the test, but here's some information. Usually, fatigue tends to come from a lack of energy. Is it because lactic acid is accumulating? Not necessarily. When we do studies and we have people, and we can do blood tests to measure lactate or lactic acid, there's not always a clear correlation between high levels of lactic acid and fatigue. It may be involved, so we think it's involved, but it ultimately seems to come down to ATP. For a given point in time, the muscle is not able to generate ATP quick enough to fuel what the muscle is asking for. I'm not going to ask you about this either. There are ways to assess muscular fitness and aerobic fitness, max VO2. This is more of an aerobic cardiovascular fitness. I'm not going to ask you this either, but if you're interested, we could measure a lactate threshold. And this is the point at which lactate begins to accumulate quickly and accumulate faster than we can get rid of it. We're always going to accumulate some lactate. We're always going to accumulate some lactate. The problem comes when we begin to generate lactate at a greater rate than we can get rid of it, and therefore it accumulates. You don't need to know this. I'm happy to answer your questions at another time, but just to give you a basic. And of course, we can assess muscle. I'm not going to ask you this either. You know this. We can assess strength in a 1 rep max. And then you could set up a program. You do a 1 rep max on a bench press. Let's say it's 100 pounds. That's probably pretty low, but I can barely lift the bar. So let's say it's 100 pounds. Well, then you can set up the intensity of a workout program. So you can measure that intensity, which is going to allow you to better create a well-designed exercise routine. You might say, today we're doing 60% of 1 rep max. And at 60% of 1 rep max, you're going to be able to do 8 to 10 reps. The next day, 2 days later, maybe you want to do 80 to 90% of 1 rep max. So it's a higher intensity day, but you're only going to do 4 reps, whatever. We can do muscular endurance. That would be like the push-up test. So that would be measuring not just strength in one bout, but endurance over time, the push-up test. We can measure muscular power, like a counter movement, vertical jump. You can measure muscle size with the girth, just a tape measure. We can do body fat percentage. There's a bunch of ways to assess muscle. This is all, actually, this is not extra. I said that and then I caught myself. I would like you to be able to define atrophy and hypertrophy. Don't worry about dystrophy. That is when there's some sort of abnormality. Atrophy means loss of muscle. Hypertrophy is gain of muscle mass. Gain of muscle mass. What is the point of lifting weights? Hypertrophy. We want to lay down more actin and myosin within a muscle. That's the goal. Atrophy could happen after you have surgery. This person has had knee surgery. They're not going to be able to utilize their quads for a period of time as much. What's going to happen to their quads? They're going to atrophy. You don't use it, you lose it to a certain extent. By the way, do I have it on here? No. By the way, there's something else called hyperplasia. And this would be, technically, an increase in the number of muscle cells. In this case, muscle. Well, when we build muscle, it's usually not hyperplasia. It's not that we increase the number of muscle cells. When you do lifting and we increase muscle mass, it's not that you increase the number. That's not really how it works. Rather, however many muscle cells you have, you increase the size of the muscle cells. We tend to be born with or grow up to have a certain number of muscle cells based on our genetics. And that's not really going to change the number of muscle cells. But what you can do is change the size of the muscle cells. An increase in the muscle cell size due to laying down more actin and myosin is hypertrophy. By the way, it's the same thing with fat. We tend to be born with and develop a certain number of fat cells based on genetics. What you do with those fat cells, we can increase them in size or we can decrease in size. Couple things. I'm not going to ask you about rigor mortis. Oh, here, I already had it on here. It's not hyperplasia. I get carried away, folks. It's not hyperplasia. It's more that we increase in size, and that's hypertrophy. So I'd like you to just know that. Other benefits of training, we actually increase the number of mitochondria. So we can lay down more mitochondria within the muscle cells we already have. We can pump more blood out. We can have a lower heart rate and pump out the same or more volume of blood. And we can transport oxygen better. I just want you to know hypertrophy. I'm going to let you review this on the side if you want. We just don't have enough time. People ask me, Dr. J, how does muscle grow? Guess what? I've got a whole PowerPoint available for you. I'm going to let you look at that if you're more interested. It talks about actually how does the muscle lay down more mass. It does it in the myofibrils, actin and myosin. We can lay down more volume in the sarcomere, and we can also lay down more volume in the connective tissue in and around the muscle. Of course, we can only do this if we have enough amino acids available, which most of us do, and if you give it rest, which is a harder thing for some of us. I'm not going to ask you about this. The only thing I'm going to have you know regarding this is mTOR. mTOR is a chemical that is the primary regulator of building muscle. Hypertrophy, building muscle. mTOR, doesn't even matter what it is. If you're interested, it's mammalian target of rapamycin. But inside the muscle, that is what is regulating this process. Look, we bring in amino acids like leucine. We have hormones helping to signal. And this is what's going to help build the muscle, increase the size. I just want you to know mTOR. This is extra information about how the muscle grows. We tend to start to slowly increase the muscle protein synthesis after exercise. The peak rate occurs 1 to 2 hours after, but it continues for up to 24 hours plus. You don't need to know all this. The only thing I needed you to know for this is mTOR. It's important to bring in protein after an exercise. We have a recovery window. Okay. All right. I want to go back briefly and revisit cardiac muscle. Do you remember at the beginning, we reviewed there's 3 types of muscle: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. We talked mostly about cardiac. We've been focusing on skeletal. All that we've been talking about is skeletal muscle, skeletal muscle, skeletal muscle. Let's just go back and talk about cardiac muscle. How is it different than skeletal? How is it the same? So the structural differences. Well, first, here's what I want to say. Skeletal and cardiac, very similar in structure. This is important. Overall, skeletal and cardiac muscle are very similar in structure. Very. We saw this in the histology chapter. Very similar. So please know that. Skeletal and cardiac are very similar in structure. There are some differences. We pointed out that the cardiac muscle contains the intercalated discs, those thicker bands every so often on the histology picture. We're going to talk more about that in A&P2. The one difference I'm going to point out, cardiac muscle has more mitochondria because it's got to contract all the time. It contracts at a lower intensity, but it can contract for longer. Obviously, because our heart is beating every time we're alive, right? All the time we're alive. In order to fuel that, cardiac muscle has more mitochondria. You don't have to know the amount. That's just there, FYI. What are some of the functional differences? You already know this, but please review. Skeletal muscle is voluntarily controlled. Cardiac is involuntary. When we compare the two, skeletal muscle is more geared for a high intensity, short-lasting contraction. Whereas cardiac muscle, compared to each other, I'm not saying it doesn't contract with a decent amount of intensity, cardiac muscle, but compared to each other, it's a lower intensity than skeletal muscle and longer lasting. This has to do with the differences in their functions. Evolutionarily, with evolution, and skeletal muscle is really about protection from danger. Skeletal muscle allows us to run away, fight or flight from immediate danger. So we need quick, powerful contractions. Think about the caveman. Think about something happening out there and you need to be able to run away from it quickly. So skeletal muscle has been designed in an evolutionary sense for protection. Get out quick or fight quick. Whereas cardiac muscle is more designed for lower and slower, but longer. Cardiac muscle is not designed for protection. It's designed to pump out blood all the time for all the time that you're alive. Those are the things you need to remember, please. Later in A&P2, as an aside, we're going to talk about a small portion of cardiac muscle that can contract on its own without a nerve impulse. What? Really cool. Stick around for A&P2 for that. Right now, you don't need to know that. Okay, that was our quick review for cardiac muscle. Cardiac and skeletal muscle are very similar when it comes to structure. Cardiac and skeletal, very similar when it comes to structure. One difference is that cardiac muscle has more mitochondria. Functionally, even though they contract the same way, sliding filament theory, even though skeletal and cardiac contract the same way, they contract at different intensities for different lengths of time. Smooth muscle. So here's what I want to say about smooth muscle. Smooth muscle it's not as similar. I'm trying to choose my words carefully. Not as similar in structure to skeletal muscle. So the key takeaway, skeletal and cardiac muscle are very similar. Skeletal and cardiac muscle are very similar. Skeletal and smooth, not as similar. Smooth muscle doesn't have striations. And there's some other differences. You don't need to know these differences. We're not going to spend time focusing on smooth muscle. But the important takeaway is that smooth muscle is not as similar in structure. When we talk about contraction of smooth muscle, this is also different. So remember, cardiac and skeletal muscle contract very similarly. Sliding filament theory, blah, blah, blah. Smooth muscle is a little bit different. I'm trying to give you a little bit of an insight without trying to get too specific. Smooth muscle contracts more in a way where it shrivels. So this is a relaxed smooth muscle. And it's kind of cool because the actin and myosin, or the myofilaments, instead of being arranged like this in skeletal and cardiac muscle, in smooth muscle, it kind of forms like a lattice. So they're structured differently, which means they contract differently. So when a smooth muscle contracts, it kind of shrivels like a worm in the rain. Has a different, so it's not quite the linear sliding filament theory. It more shrivels. I give you some other information, but that's all I want you to know from this. Okay, I want to start this chapter, but I don't need to get into everything with you because, let me point this out. For this chapter, we have a couple of things to review at the beginning, okay? But a lot of this chapter is knowing the muscles. You just have to know where the muscles are, which we did in lab. But a lot of this chapter is adding the action. So I don't need to talk about that as much because that's memorization. So to that end, I'm helping you folks. You will see under your muscular system lecture, I have made a cheat sheet for you. I've given you the muscles, and then I've told you what actions to know. I can't make it any simpler. You need to be able, most of these are the same muscles that we did in lecture. Some of them are added, but I will talk about them in lecture. Some of them are added. But for all the others, you can start memorizing these. Some of them are pretty simple. We talked about the flexors of the wrist. What do they do in the forearm? They flex the wrist. You should know what the biceps does, elbow flexion. So you can begin to memorize these on your own. I've given you the perfect study guide. Make note cards, do whatever you got to do. What I want to do in the more lecture part is do the beginning part of this chapter. The beginning part of this chapter is reminding ourselves of the functions of muscle. We've been focusing on movement. But don't forget, it's not just skeletal muscle. Don't we have movement of smooth muscle in our GI tract? Peristalsis helps to move things through our GI tract. We have smooth muscle lining our arteries or blood vessels. So it's not just movement that we can see like a bicep curl. There's movement inside the body. Muscles are contracting even without you realizing it for stability. Think about your abdominal and your back muscles. A lot of them are contracting all the time to hold you up. We rely on muscle to control our body openings, our anal and urethral sphincters. I'm not going to focus on that, but I want to point it out. We rely on our muscles to produce heat. If it's cold, we can shiver. All right. This is a review. The only connective tissue I wanted you to know was the covering over the whole muscle, which is the epimysium. There are other types of connective tissue coverings. You might be interested in the fascia. Fasciae is just plural. Fascia is singular. This would be the connective tissue surrounding groups of muscle, for example, like the connective tissue covering the entire 4 muscles of the quadriceps. The epimysium covers each individual muscle. The fascia covers a group of muscles that work together. I've mentioned in lab that a muscle has the muscle belly. At either end is a tendon which connects the muscle belly to the skeleton. What I want to add here is that generally the insertion is what moves more towards the origin. It's not quite equal in how it shortens. It's a little bit more that the insertion, which is distal, moves more towards the origin. You don't need to know these. There's different arrangement of muscle fibers. I think you already know that. You know your pectoralis major. The muscle fibers are more arranged like this. There's muscles around your mouth or your eye that are more circular. So depending on the function of the muscle fibers can be arranged differently. We, of course, talked about this in the abdomen. The external oblique has fibers going down and in. The rectus abdominis has muscle fibers going up and down. They have certain names. For right now, I am not going to ask you to know them. Here's what I do want to talk about. I want to talk about, before we finish this video, the coordinated muscle actions, and then I'd like to talk about concentric, eccentric, isometric, and isokinetic actions. Okay, here we go. Muscle groups, muscles and muscle groups work together. We tend to assign, based on how they're working, we assign terms to that. Let's start with prime mover. The prime mover or the agonist. This is the muscle that's doing the motion. This is the muscle that does the motion. If we're talking about a bicep curl, what muscle is doing the motion? The biceps brachii. If we're talking about a leg extension, what muscle is doing leg extension? Quadriceps. Okay? However, we also tend to have some synergists, which are helpers. If we're talking about the biceps brachii, maybe the prime mover or agonist is the biceps brachii, but a helper is the brachialis underneath it. If I'm talking about the quads is tough because the quads kind of function on their own. Yeah, it's just a helper. Another muscle that does a similar action that helps. But here's the important part, and something you may or may not already know. The certain muscles that are doing it help to perform the motion. But in order for this proposition to work, there has to be the opposing muscle group that relaxes. So the antagonist is the opposing muscle group that relaxes. If I'm talking about the bicep curl, the biceps brachii does the motion. A helper might be the brachialis. What's the muscle group opposite of the biceps brachii? The triceps brachii. The opposing muscle group has to relax. That allows the prime mover to do its job. If, folks, you can make sense of this. If the biceps brachii and the triceps brachii both contract at the same time, if the biceps brachii and triceps brachii contract at the same time, isn't it going to be a stalemate? One muscle is trying to flex at the elbow, the other muscle is trying to extend at the elbow. You'd have a stalemate. So we want one muscle group to contract to do its job, and we want the opposing muscle group to relax so that the other muscle group can do its job. My cats are making noises there. Don't just... Then we have some stabilizers. They do what the word says it is, stabilizers. These tend to be postural muscles. Think about the abdominals, the core, the back. We can also have neutralizers. Neutralizers help to prevent an undesired motion. It's a little bit different from a stabilizer. A stabilizer helps you to maintain the form. If we're talking about let's talk about the leg extension. Let's work together for leg extension. I have examples coming later, but we'll just do it together. So let's say that our example is a leg extension machine. For leg extension, what's going to be the prime mover? Quads. What might be well, actually, let's do it this way. Depending on how you're doing a leg extension, let's say that the prime mover is the rectus femoris. That's one of the quad muscles, right? A synergist might be the vastus intermedius. It's helping to do the same thing. Both of these are helping to extend at the knee. What's the antagonist? If I'm using my quadriceps to perform the motion, what's going to be the antagonist? The hamstrings. They have to relax to let the quads do their job. What might be a stabilizer? Probably my abs. You want to make sure that you're holding your abdominals, you're holding your trunk in one position so that you're only activating the quads to do leg extension. It's more of a just to have good form. You want to keep certain body segments static. You want to hold certain body segments in place and only move the one that you're focusing. Usually a stabilizer is more of a postural muscle, like the core. What could be an example of a neutralizer? Well, maybe we have the adductors. So in our example of a leg extension, I only want to extend at the leg. So maybe my adductors contract a little bit, not much, but they contract a little bit to prevent the undesired abduction. When you're doing a leg extension, you don't want your hip to move out to the side. So even without you realizing it, to keep your leg straight, your adductors might contract a little to prevent the undesired abduction. If I want to prevent abduction, I want to adduct a little. We're going to have a chance to practice this more in person. This is looking at, instead of leg extension, this is looking at knee flexion. So if you want to practice on your own, yes, shameless self-promotion, because there's me. Knee flexion. So what would be the agonist for knee flexion? So you can practice. I give you another one with a stiff arm here, which is really cool. I'm asking you the motions occurring at the shoulder and the elbow, so you can practice. And then a trunk example. So practice those. When we come back in person, we will see how you did. The last thing I want to introduce, and this is important, would be types of contraction. Let's start with the types of contraction that you are familiar with. When a muscle shortens, that's what we're talking. We've talked about that most. When you think of muscle contraction, you're usually thinking of what we consider isotonic. An isotonic contraction is a contraction that results in movement. Either I flex a joint, or I extend a joint, or I abduct, or I adduct, or I rotate, or I elevate, or I pronate, or I dorsiflex, whatever. That's what you think of. The traditional contraction that results in muscle movement is isotonic. Within that, however, there's two types. The type that you're familiar with is concentric. That's when the muscle shortens. When I do a bicep curl with a concentric contraction, the biceps shortens. However, what you may not be as familiar with is an eccentric contraction. This is a type of muscle contraction, a situation where the muscle contracts, but it results in lengthening. And this tends to act as a braking or a slowing force. In this example here, this would be an example of a concentric contraction. Doing a deadlift, coming up. What are the muscles that are contracting when I do a deadlift going up? Glutes. So when I move up, the glutes are shortening. However, in order to do that, don't you have to slowly squat down? Usually eccentric is not the primary focus. Usually the focus is the shortening. That's where you are actually doing the lift. But the prep phase in that, for doing a deadlift, it's not a deadlift, I'm sorry. Folks, it's been a long weekend. This is pushing up, right? So this will be like a leg extension standing. You folks who lift probably have an idea of what it is. The name in the gym. The pushing up, that's where the actual lift happens. That's where you're exerting the most force. However, to get in this position, to crouch down before I can push back up, we have a lengthening of the muscle. And you have to contract some muscles in order to do that with control. Excuse me. One of the best examples I can think of an eccentric contraction, I don't have a picture here. Excuse me one moment. It's allergy season. One example I can think of for eccentric. Think about after a really heavy workout or after a race and your legs are really tired, but you've got to go to the bathroom. You got to pee. Sometimes after a tough leg day, the hardest thing is lowering yourself to the toilet seat, right? That's why, do you ever use the handicap rail or the rail or the side of the stall or in your house, the edge of the counter? Because it's so hard to control lowering your body into that seat. That is an example of an eccentric contraction of the quads. When you go from standing to sitting, your quads are lengthening. So they're not contracting in the same way they would in a leg press machine or a leg extension. However, they have to contract a little to control, slow, or brake that motion, act as a brake. If your car is going downhill fast, you want to have the brakes on to control it. If your quads didn't contract a little when you lowered yourself to the toilet seat, you would just fall down. That's an instance, though, after a hard leg day where it's harder because your quads are already sore and tight. I pulled together a video, and I just posted this, and I just found this, and I really like it. This shows us the difference between eccentric and concentric. When a muscle shortens, it's concentric. When a muscle lengthens, eccentric. Concentric, it shortens. Eccentric, it lengthens. Concentric, eccentric. So there's a way to contract each one. Well, yeah, relaxation. And I really like how they're showing this whole thing, right? We're going to talk about isometric in a middle. When you lower a weight, you have to lower it slowly, eccentric. When I pull it back up, concentric. When I pull up the weight, bicep curl, concentric. When I lower it back down, eccentric. When I pull it up, concentric. I really like this video. I think you should look at it. I think it's going to help. Okay, let's finish our discussion here. Isotonic is when there's a change or a movement of a body part, and there's a change in muscle length. You might also see isotonic defined as some sort of muscle contraction where there's a change in muscle length. In other words, there's movement. The most common is concentric, and then we have eccentric when it contracts while it's lengthening. There's also something called isometric. Isometric is when you contract a muscle, but there's no movement. What are some examples of this? If I just hold this position, I'm contracting muscles to hold it, but there's no movement in the muscle. No change in muscle length. I do a wall push-up, where I just push against the wall, but no movement. I don't actually do the push-up, I just push against the wall. Or I do a wall sit. A great example is a wall sit. You contract the muscle, but there's no movement, no shortening. Lastly, there is isokinetic. This can only be done with a machine. You might see this in rehabilitation or a high level of testing. This must be done with a machine. Maybe you've seen this. The benefit of the isokinetic testing is that it can move at a set constant speed at a set resistance. You control the computer, you program the computer to be at a constant speed and a set resistance. So we can do all sorts of fun combinations, folks. I can do knee flexion and extension, concentric, where the machine allows me to concentrically do knee flexion. It applies resistance, so I have to pull back. And then it applies resistance in a different way, so I push out. Concentric. It could be at a slow speed, 90 degrees per second, or a fast speed, 240 degrees per second. Or you can set it to be eccentric also. Maybe instead of that, I want to do concentric, eccentric, which means I'm working the hamstrings both ways. So what's going to happen is the machine is going to first give resistance this way, and you contract your hamstrings to resist that. So you're contracting your hamstrings as it's pushing you down eccentrically. But then, oh, wait a minute, I have that backwards. Folks, I'm really tired today. Whew. Okay, let's try this again. The way it's set up first is you would do the hamstrings concentrically. You would pull your leg back. That moves the hamstrings. But instead of pushing back out, now the unit is going to give force this way. And it's going to force you to contract your hamstrings to slow going back up. So I could use the machine to set resistance. Either the pads here will push or pull to purposely cause me to contract a muscle group concentrically or eccentrically. It's really cool. I've given you some examples. This is what's commonly used after someone is completing or near completing an ACL reconstructive surgery. You can actually measure. We want to make sure that there's a certain percentage of strength back. So you can measure it. So here we've done concentric. The concentric flexors would be the hamstrings. The concentric extensors would be the quads. So here we're measuring the strength of the hamstrings and quads at a certain speed. What was the speed for this one? Sure, it's on here somewhere. All right. And then in another one, we've done concentric. Oh, that's the same one. Okay. So one of the things we can do is we can look at the hamstring to quad ratio. So we'll get to this in class. You can do it if you want, though. We can actually measure the strength to each other. This is the same data that we just got. It was a fast speed, 240 degrees per second. For an athlete, this is where we would expect it to be. We want the hamstrings to be 75 to 80% of the quads. For a non-athlete, it could be a little bit lower. You divide. So we want to divide hamstrings into quads. So I would do 45 divided by 54. Hamstrings divided by quads. And see how they did. Were their hamstrings this percentage? Pretty cool. All right. I'm going to end there. But please study, study, study. Make sure you start memorizing those actions. All right. See you next time.